Good morning, Dr. Schild. How are you today?
Um, Thank you, Joe. I'm fine and anxious to talk about the nature of the white light, the mysterious white light that's encountered in the UFO abduction phenomena.
Yes, and also I've learned from you, you think that it's related to near-death experiences as well, the white light that people see during near-death experiences.
I think that the character is similar, but the origin is very different. At near death, you don't see a flying saucer. But what I also know is that if you are leaving the physical space of our universe, you must pass through an outer boundary of the universe. And this has that inside out black hole structure, where I think I've explained to you before that an ordinary black hole we see in our universe stands at the boundary between the physical space that we experience every day and the internal black hole space, which is non-physical, but is only quantum description. And in the case of our universe, it's backwards. The inside, in the case of our outer boundary, is the physical space that we call home. And outside is the space between all universes. And we call this a horizon correctly. And that horizon has its own light, just like black holes have light. And so people experience intensely this light as they approach it to depart the universe, and for their soul to then move to that space of all being, that all oneness, in which our universe is only one embedded bubble of physical space.
Now, I understand you have a word for this, and we've been discussing this for the last several weeks, quadrupole radiation.
Yes. Um, we'll be talking largely about quadrupole radiation then, and it's my intent, because it's something that's not understood by practically anybody. I would like to remind the engineers, electrical engineers, and the scientists who understand the Maxwell equations that describe emission and absorption of electromagnetic radiation, and remind that in the derivation of the Maxwell equations from Ampere's law and from Coulomb's law, at one point, your professor at the blackboard said, now, one solution to these partial differential equations would be the description of ordinary light, propagating from a light source to all distances, but diminishing as it goes away from the source because it's spreading out to fill the entire space. Then he tells you that we simplify the Maxwell's equations in their derivation by setting one particular term to zero. And that term describes the dispersion or the outward flowing of energy from a particle or a physical object. But because we don't believe we can see magnetic monopoles in our universe, we set this term to zero. And so the commonly expressed Maxwell equations are missing some important terms for the complete description of electromagnetism. And that's useful to communications engineers and for our our general understanding of light propagation in astronomy. But in dealing with the extraterrestrial subject, that doesn't work anymore. And we have to come to terms with higher order solutions to the Maxwell equations. Now, I'm sorry there are some people in your audience who might be bored to tears with this, but if I don't say it as completely as possible, then there are many who will criticize us for being all pie in the sky and having no substance to this discussion. So we have to talk a little bit about this quadrupole radiation, which has very different properties than ordinary light, in that it is an effect of electromagnetism that remains basically local to the radiating source. And it expresses more properties of the quantum space than ordinary dipole radiation. And so ordinary light now, and I will distinguish between ordinary light and this quadrupole radiation. Ordinary light, you can see where it's coming from. It's emanating from a light bulb. And if you hold up your hand to it, you see if you hold your hand up to it like this, you will see the light illuminating your hand, but on the backside, you will see shadow. You won't see the light. Not true of quadrupole radiation. Quadrupole radiation has the property that it's more enveloping you over the local environment in proximity to or close to the radiating source and the electromagnetic fields that are generating all this radiation. So this quadrupole light has been understood for over 100 years, but rarely talked about. And so we've managed to get through with all of our engineers and scientists talking about dipole radiation. But now the subject of the UFO takes us to this other kind of radiation. I would like to call attention to the best description of it that I know in Susie Hansen's book. The title of the book is The Dual Soul Connection, in which she describes her having grown up with the understanding that while she is here on Earth and a normal human being, when she is abducted and goes to the mother craft above our atmosphere, she becomes an alien. Her one single brain can accommodate two souls. She has her human soul and her alien gray soul. And she describes what it's like when she becomes abducted, goes to the mother craft, enters it, but then is escorted to the crew quarters, where she describes how she's instructed to just stand over there and we're going to make the adjustment. And she feels her body slowly changing. She feels her fourth finger of 5, she has a thumb. Her fourth finger disappears slowly, and her remarkable thumb that can rotate all the way around, whereas ours can't bend back any further. You'd like it to go this way to be an alien. They can do that, but humans can't. She also feels her skin becoming scaly. And then at that point, she becomes an alien gray, and she eats alien gray food. And she describes in her book a little cooking lesson, or how they consume food, how they excrete leftovers, and so on. So there's a lot more to be said and learned from reading her book carefully, but I can summarize it pretty well for you. And I want to ask you now, Joe, do you have any personal experience with the second kind of radiation, the kind that does not make shadows on the backside of your hand?
I do. And before we get into that, I want to touch on what you just said, because I'm sure that there's some skeptics out there that are thinking alien grays, dual souls, everything, related to everything you just said. Does this not tie in with Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo astronaut, and his quantum hologram theory?
It absolutely does. And in fact, Edgar Mitchell has had his own experience of this, and you can read a full account of it in his book published years ago. It's titled The Way of the Explorer by Edgar Mitchell. And he does describe an experience that he later understood has been known to Indian mystics for a long time. The experience is called samadhi. And he describes how on his return voyage from the moon as an Apollo 14 astronaut, now having completed the mission and returning to Earth, he describes how he was in the spacecraft returning, and the astronauts called it barbecue mode because if the sun is over there, they have a sense of themselves rotating in their spacecraft as though they're being barbecued by the sunlight. And so they call this barbecue mode. Anyway, at one point where he was very relaxed on his return voyage, the mission had been completed, he found himself entering into an amazing state he had never felt before. He felt as though he was seeing a new form of light. He felt as though he was at one with the entire universe and in contact with all the space of the universe for all time. And so this is known to the most respected of people, our astronaut corps, and Edgar Mitchell, especially, where he had a PhD degree from MIT. He was knowledgeable of all of these things like Maxwell's equations and all of that. And so while we never talked about it in detail, I know from the account in his book that he has the experience of the white light.
Beautiful. And one final thing I'd like to touch on, I feel that this man's research would also tie in what we're discussing. Dr. John Mack, who met the Dalai Lama, he said that when he met the Dalai Lama and he discussed all of these things with the Dalai Lama had zero issues with any of this. As a matter of fact, this has been understood by them for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this is not some new thing. This is very well documented by very respected, very well educated men and women across the planet. You asked me about my experience with quadrupole radiation.
Yes.
And yes, I have had one experience with it. And I would like to ask you, I may have had actually two experiences with it. The first being my missing time experience, where I was driving in Oakland,
Yes.
California. The car was beamed by light. There was two other people in the car with me, and we instantaneously from Jackson Street in Oakland, California, appeared at the Great America parking lot. We were traveling at freeway speeds, and in the snap of a finger, the car was no longer moving, and we were 45, 50 minutes away. Now, that was my first experience with quadrupole radiation. It's life changing. And that's why I want to get into the second thing. I want to know if you concur with if this is an example of quadrupole radiation. When I saw a flying saucer over Bay Point, California, just looking at the light that was illuminating off of the craft, it was life-changing. Now, again, the missing time experience, I had to undergo hypnosis to remember a lot of this. This flying saucer sighting in Bay Point, California in 2015, I was totally conscious. I was seeing it. I got a photograph of it, and I'll never forget looking at the light illuminating off of this craft. It changed me. It literally changed my life. When you see this light radiating, there's no mistaking it. There's no mistaking that this is something that you've never seen before. There's no mistaking that this is something very special, and it just changes you as a person. Now, there was no missing time associated with it, but there was a very special light illuminating from this craft displaying anti-gravity technology. And just seeing this light changed me forever. Would you consider that an example of quadrupole radiation?
Very much so. And this has actually been written up in some more detail also by Dr. Robert Davis, who calls the first time that you consciously notice this radiation, he calls that a peak experience. And he says that many people seeing UFO phenomena have such a peak experience. And he details how having the peak experience gives you a very ecstatic feeling of being totally connected with the entire universe. As I said before, like you're in contact with all space at all time. And you feel like with your mind, you could go anywhere. And so it does happen to people. I wouldn't say commonly, but it seems to be associated almost always with the UFO sighting experience. I would like to give some more examples that have been told to be anecdotally by other experiencers. One person mentioned to me how he had an experience where in the middle of the night, he was awakened by intensely bright light leaking under the door of his home. And this was long after he had had his UFO missing time experience and was presumably sensitive to the quadrupole radiation. And he then talked about how the next day, when he looked out in the yard where the light he found had been coming from, yes, there was a burn mark in the ground, and evidently a craft had been there. But he said it was in a small space between my house and a neighbor. And he said the neighbor never noticed anything strange. So the neighbor wasn't sensitized to this kind of light. Remember, this kind of light does not spread out like ordinary light. Quadrupole radiation stays local to the source. And
Very good.
that is a major difference. But if you are sensitive to it, you will see it only if your brain has learned how to sense it. That happens when you are having this peak experience. Suddenly, your brain is overwhelmed by all of this quadrupole light impinging on it and discovers that to understand it, it has to activate new neural networks. It has to change the neural structure of its overall sensing apparatus and electrical apparatus. And it therefore becomes sensitive to this new kind of radiation. And that is what then becomes the peak experience. a new sensitivity to the entire universe and all the vastness of its space and time.
Beautiful. I'd also like to note, after I had my peak experience, as you're calling it, with witnessing the lights illuminating from this craft, it almost was like it was forcing me into the next natural stage of evolution. This is my belief, but I believe that seeing these sorts of lights and these sorts of craft forces you to spiritually and in some ways physically evolve. An example would be, after I saw the light in Bay Point, California, consciously, mind you, this wasn't the missing time experience, which required hypnosis. When I saw the light consciously, I started noticing heightened psychic ability. Can you comment on that?
That's excellent. And that has to do, well, the physics, let me say the physics of what is going on with that is that once your brain has been modified to become sensitive to the quadrupole radiation, well, there are other things that are what we call the quantum description of the universe, or let's just say the shadow of our universe on its space-time structure. Anyway, that description now is easily accessible to your brain. And so you see other sensitivities to things that are expressed in quantum space, that is, feelings and it's new sensitivities to the operation of the universe. And so, for example, in some people, it takes the form of, oh, I'm finding now that television sets switch on and off randomly in my presence. So that means that your brain is able to operate in new ways and project information out of you to open conduction paths in the little sensors that allow you to sit on your comfortable couch with your clicker, and that then gets received by the television set. That can happen spontaneously through cranial activity, to brain activity, once you have been exposed to the new three-dimensional aspects of the white light, the quadrupole radiation.
Now, for some people that maybe have zero background in physics, I'm going to try to put this
Okay.
I'm going to try to put this into words for them, and tell me if I'm doing it correctly. Dipole radiation is basically an example of natural light. For example, the light that I have right here for film, there's a source to it. It's directly in front of my face, and the light shines upon my face. Quadrupole radiation, there is no light, there is no source locally. The source is coming from a quantum realm. It's coming from another dimension, if you will. This is where the light source is coming from. Is that fair to say?
Excellent. Excellent. So in order to give you and your viewers some idea of what the origin of this quadrupole radiation actually looks like, we like to have a physical picture. This picture that I have, it doesn't really exist in space anywhere, but it's just meant to show you that the sourcing of the light envelops you. It's not that it shines on you, it envelops you. And that's why I say, if you wonder if you are in its presence, hold your hand up and you will see the front side of your hand is illuminated, but the back side is not. However, if you are in the quadrupole light, it completely surrounds you and surrounds all space. It penetrates all space. And so it has no shadows. And the example with the hand is only one of many examples I could give, but basically it's always the same story. Ordinary dipole light has a source as a light bulb, shines on things which reflect it back to your eyes, which allows you to see things, but always has a shadowed side. Whereas the quadrupole light, Susie Hansen has described it as almost having a soft, velvety feeling to her skin when she was admitted to the light elevator on board a spacecraft, which had one of these light elevators built into it. And she describes how you walk into this place of the elevator and you're seemingly instantaneously transported to another opening where you exit it and you find that you're on a different floor of the spacecraft. But that's where she had the most intense exposure to the light and could describe its soft, velvety texture.
Is time relevant during a quadrupole radiation experience?
You find that time is severely warped, and the time does exist to the extent of its property of sequencing events. In other words, if you remember back to your abduction experience when you did see this light and when things were happening to you, you do have a logical order from which they occurred. But what happens is that the time can be enormously stretched or compressed. It's at the mercy of other fields, in particular the quantum field of the universe. And so the answer to your question is yes. There is time. It is a sequencing of events, but you can't trust your feeling of it. What you can always do is say, I know I have a heartbeat that runs at about once per second. And so from my heartbeat, I know that time is passing, but I don't get a sense of how much time has passed. That's gotten stretched or unstretched or something. And so your perception can be very different from the reality of time experienced by everybody else around you.
Beautiful. And I'd also like to give another example of quadrupole radiation because we're going to be discussing it in the coming weeks with Dr. Lynn Katai, specifically the Phoenix Lights event. And the thing that she's been focusing on, it's been 25 years since the sighting. A massive craft appeared over the city of Phoenix, floated by. And the thing that Dr. Katai is most fascinated with, especially recently, is how it changed the lives of many people just by witnessing the illumination of this quadrupole radiation.
There it is. So even innocent bystanders who didn't get abducted, because of the intensity of the source, as they tried to see it and make sense of it there in the sky, they had to develop the neural networks appropriate to a three-dimensional view of the universe, which then allows you to participate in time-independent things, and also for you to telepathically communicate with other sentient beings through the broader band of the quadrupole radiation. So once you're there, you're in, and you'll find that you have a good sense of the feelings of animals. We know of horse whisperers and of pet whisperers, and it's likely that they had some kind of this experience which makes them able to sense the goings on in the minds of other sentient beings, even though they be animals.
You know, and it forces me to think, this has been running through my mind the last few weeks since we've been discussing this on the phone privately, was most people would think psychic experiences are local to Earth. Like, oh, I'm sensing this and it's occurring, you know, in the state of Nevada, or, oh, I sense something is occurring with you personally. If we look at the case of Dr. Edgar Mitchell and his experience, you realize that psychic experience isn't limited to Earth. It spreads throughout the universe. Your psychic abilities can bring you anywhere in the universe. An example would be, according to my research, are you familiar with the CIA Project Stargate program, the psychic spies?
Uh, yes, that also related to what you would call remote viewing then. That
Exactly.
project was a Stanford project, as I recall.
Exactly. And it was highly classified at the time. It's my understanding, you know, the CIA was getting great results from these remote viewers, and some guy at CIA had the great idea of, hey, let's see what happens if we give them coordinates to Mars. And it worked.
Oh my goodness. I hadn't heard this.
It's true. My point is, psychic abilities are not limited to Earth. If we look at how Project Stargate had the remote viewers, and by the way, they did not tell the remote viewers that they were going to be viewing Mars. They simply wrote down coordinates on a piece of paper. They didn't say, hey, you're going to Mars today. You're gonna focus on this set of coordinates and you're gonna go to Mars. They naturally were brought to Mars just by observing these coordinates written on a piece of paper. So psychic abilities are not limited to just Earth. They can bring you anywhere in the universe. I was wondering, what's your opinion on this?
Yes, this is all true. The information about what's going on Mars spreads throughout the universe, and sufficiently sensitive people just making themselves open to this material can tune into those coordinates and tune into what activities are going on there or what's exciting to people and so on. I also would like to say that it's possible that the UFO program, which really shifted into high gear near the end of World War II, seemingly, Susie Hansen says that this occurs because the atomic explosions detonated, destroying cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, broadcast an enormous signal throughout the universe that, hey, these guys are out of control. They don't know. They're dealing with forces that they can't control adequately, and they're in danger of destroying their civilization and their planet. They need help, and much of what we see as UFO sightings is reconnaissance of the Earth, where these foreign people from another star, another planet, are here to try to first learn about us well enough that they can help us. However, I caution you that there is the breeding program. And what we're seeing is that there is an extensive breeding program that you have partaken of. Your reproductive materials were forcibly removed from you, and you were shown your offspring when you visited the spacecraft, the UFO. So what should we think about this UFO related breeding program? In a sense, nobody asked us as a human species for our permission to mingle or merge with us and create hybrids that combine both human and alien genetic materials. From their point of view, I believe, they would say, well, that's the only way we can help you. We have to become very close to you and put a better way of living on your plate before you and show you the advantages of a different kind of living that is not so egocentric and so what would I call it? So collecting centric, and so they understand that it will be a difficult and long program to merge the species, but we demonstrated that we have not been good stewards of our planets, and they would conclude that we need help. And so, without our permission, they are doing these things to human beings. And when we're examining what we did to the American natives when we came to these shores, we didn't really ask for the Indians for permission to take over the whole continent. We perhaps made local agreements to establish a settlement in Jamestown or in Plymouth or wherever they were meeting with Indians. But I suspect that they never agreed to a takeover of the entire continent. Now, in the light of this, how do we feel about the hybrid program? John Mack said in his books that the discovery that such a program is well underway, that was the most important conclusion of his book, Abductions, published in 1994. And I'm not so sure I've resolved in my own mind whether this is justified for them to come and interact with the human species, because it might be solving two problems at the same time. It might be that the prospects of their moving here and joining with us offer them an escape valve if their planet suddenly comes to catastrophe, which could happen through no mistake of theirs, but rather because the star that hosts a family of planets for them has come to even natural evolutionary changes and gone supernova, and they know that they don't have long to live on their planet. So it may turn out that the hybridization program benefits the two participants. And we don't understand this well enough for there to yet be a meaningful discussion of what the implications are for the human species and how do we feel about this being done involuntarily. Now, many people have the sense that, in fact, alien visits have been underway for a long time. So watch the program Ancient Aliens for plenty of that. And so I take the point of view that there's no need to worry about a takeover, because if they had any intention of doing that, they would have done so a long time ago. Probably there are species out there that are aware of us, but are a billion or several billion years older than our planet and our civilization. So the fact that they haven't done anything destructive that we can identify and seem intent on helping us to potentially avoid our own self-destruction, perhaps we should be reassured that that does not seem to be part of anybody's program.
Beautifully put. And I do subscribe to the theory that they've been coming here since forever, basically, to the planet Earth, and
Yes.
interacting with human beings, and maybe even before human beings. There may be some sort of link to our evolution, and ET intervention. And I also subscribe to the theory that the Cold War generals had when they were discussing the ET issue, was that, look, there's no threat from these guys. If there was, and this is what they said, this is a quote here, they would have cleaned our clock a long time ago. So from a military standpoint, from men who have dedicated their lives to the study of war and destruction and military tactics and strategy, they came to the conclusion very early on, look, they would have cleaned our clock a long time ago. As a matter of fact, they would have done it 10 times over by now. They've had so many opportunities and so much time, and they have never demonstrated it once. Some people may argue, well, what about the jets that have been taken out of the sky, during a UFO encounter? An example would be the Tehran UFO incident. Are you familiar with that in the 1930s?
No, I don't know that one.
Well, there's many incidents of military jet craft and fighters losing their electrical power and seemingly just dropping like an anvil out of the sky. But it's worth noting, in every single one of these cases, we armed our weapon systems and were prepared to fire at the UFOs. And the UFOs had a very clever way of not firing some sort of weapon at our craft. They just simply disabled it. And in almost all instances, with the exception of a few, the pilots were safely able to eject from the aircraft. So
excellent. And they would have known that, as a matter of fact.
So
the aliens,
really,
I mean, the aliens.
There's very little evidence of a threat. There is talk of human mutilations occurring, but there's very little research that's actually been gone into that. It is worth noting, however, but this is all I really know about any sort of ET threat. I know that the Cold War generals came to the conclusion, hey, there's no threat from these guys. If there was, they would have taken us out a long time ago, 10 times over. They would have cleaned our clocks, as the general said. And the only instances of our aircraft being fired upon were actually the electrical systems being taken out. And the only times that occurred was when we were prepared to fire a missile at the craft. So we engaged and we picked the fight first in each instance of that.
Yes.
So I subscribe to everything that you just said.
Well, Joe, I sent you an illustration to try to make some sense and give some visual presentation of what I mean when I say some of these things about the nature of the quadrupole radiation. And by the way, where I write down the word quadrupole form, I underlined the U because I believe in Wikipedia they showed either spelling correct. It is commonly spelled sometimes quadrapole, but other times quadrupole. the latter being probably closer to correct Latin. And it's for that reason I choose to use quadrupole radiation. That's a silly technical point, but we might as well get that straightened up for once and for all.
Beautiful. I
And
think it's
then
excellent.
the illustration is supposed to show you the kind of structure of 3 dimensions that this light makes. It makes an envelope in space. And within that envelope, you see and experience this quadrupole radiation. It's electromagnetic in character as light is. It's governed by the laws of physics, in particular of electromagnetic in physics. And you will notice in this illustration that the body of this radiation is roughly spherical in shape and form, but that's typical of the radiation. It's diffuse, it's not perfectly located or isolated in space. As it gets farther from the origin of the quadrupole radiation, it very rapidly declines in brightness, so that if it's seen from a large distance, like a quarter or a half a mile, it will not appear so bright. You will probably find it overwhelmed by old-fashioned, normal dipole radiation at long distances.
Let me interject here. I have one quick question. So you mentioned if you observed it from a quarter of a mile or a half mile, that's the precise distance that I sighted my craft in Bay Point, California in 2015.
Yeah.
Now, to the normal naked eye, would this light appear absolutely heavenly and undescribable? Would it be like something you've never seen before?
It would contain a superposition of the 2 kinds of radiation. And one is dipole light, which makes shadows, and the other is this quadrupole light, which does not make shadows and is local to the source of the electromagnetic disturbances that are doing the whole show.
But
now the illustration showing kind of bulgy portions to something like a structure which doesn't really exist is just something like a contour of a bright constant brightness level within the light field. And you'll notice that I show on the lower left side from the main body a pencil-like disturbance, which is sharp, highly defined. And if you look at the tip of this pencil, you will see I show with a red arrow to try to describe how there is circularity associated with this light, this form of light. That circularity is the basis for the anti-gravity that you experienced when your car was lifted off the freeway and deposited half a mile away. That it's well known that rotation can mix terms in the electromagnetic equations in such a way that they mix gravity in with physical existence. And this gets very complicated to say. That's why the Einstein equations aren't written down on a blackboard. It would take 2 boards full to write them out. This rotation is the origin of that anti-gravity experience. And I once asked an abductee who described to me his experience of being subject to this radiation or to this field and drawn out of his home through the roof, and slowly he could see that he was being lifted up toward the spacecraft. He could see the distant lights of the bay and the villages that he knew. I believe he was being taken up from Nantucket, and he knew the island and its environment well enough to recognize, oh yeah, that's one town, that's another town, that's the bay, and so on. And then from there, he entered into the spacecraft. And I was able to ask him, now I want you to recall the experience you had during this event. Did you feel when you were in this anti-gravity mode and were being lifted up, did you feel like something was pushing you upward from the bottom of your feet? Did you feel the weight of your feet on something that was pushing you up? Or was it more like you were just floating? And he replied to me, the latter. It is rather that when being in this column, my weight just disappeared and I basically just floated away and up toward the spacecraft. So that's a property of this quadrupole radiation, is that it can project rotation in its beam of influence. And that's how their remote elevator works. It's a little bit like the transporter or the tow craft that we hear about in Star Trek.
Beautiful. Let me ask you a question. As you've been giving this this talk about quadrupole radiation for the last few minutes, I've been looking at the sketch you gave of quadrupole radiation. Why does it have the cloud-like appearance in the sketch?
It's because it exists in three-dimensional space, and it takes 3 dimensions to describe it. And so it's distortions from a perfect sphere are likely to be spheroid-like. It's likely to be little spheres inside of bigger spheres, inside of yet bigger spheres, where all of the mischief that this quadrupole field does is expressed by local effects at the source.
Beautiful. And on an ending note here, because we are out of time, Caroline Corey was just messaging me as you were talking, and she has a film coming out. I'd like to recommend it to our viewers. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon Prime. It's called A Tear in the Sky by Caroline Corey, Caroline, last name Corey, Cory. Again, A Tear in the Sky. This is going to be an amazing film. She is one of the first people that took my case and brought it to the public and put it through a scientific lens. She changed my life. She's an excellent researcher on consciousness, on UFO phenomenon. Dr. Schild, you are familiar with her. And again, it's called A Tear in the Sky. It's available on Amazon Prime for pre-order right now, and it comes out the first week of May. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. Dr. Schild, what's your thoughts on the research Caroline Corey has done?
I think that Caroline is an extreme example of what we talked about near the beginning of this presentation. She is able to plug into the universe and read the mind of the universe extremely well. And so the kinds of things you talked about, the CIA program at Stanford University, she would excel at those kinds of exercises. And we were actually able to build a reproduction of the Dean Radin experimental apparatus that demonstrated mind consciousness control of a laser interferometer. And Caroline Corey was able to influence this piece of laboratory equipment and change its state from more physical-like to more quantum-like by concentrating on it. The apparatus was here in Massachusetts, and she was in Los Angeles. So she, with her mind, was able to influence a mechanical, physical apparatus at a distance of 3,000 miles. Ponder that. That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And again, the film is called A Tear in the Sky by Caroline Corey. It is available for pre-order on Amazon Prime right now, and it will be available the first week of May.